His black ex showed up with their secret baby. The billionaire's mother tried to deny everything. The boardroom fell silent as the glass doors swept open. But it wasn't the quarterly reports that made Kane Blackwood's breath catch in his throat. It was her, Gracia Monroe, standing in the doorway like a storm-given human form, her dark eyes blazing with the kind of fury that could level cities. She wore a fitted black dress that hugged curves he'd once traced with reverent fingers, and cradled against her hip was a baby carrier that made his world tilt on its axis. "Gentlemen, I believe we need to reschedule," Kane managed, his voice barely steady as 12 board members shifted uncomfortably in their leather seats. His mother, Victoria Blackwood, sat frozen at the far end of the mahogany table, her champagne-colored silk blouse suddenly looking too bright against her paling face. "No need." Gracia's voice cut through the tension like honey-coated steel. "This won't take long." She stepped further into the room, her heels clicking against marble floors that had witnessed millions in deals but never anything like this. The baby, God, the baby, stirred in the carrier, tiny fingers emerging from beneath a soft yellow blanket. Kane's eyes locked onto those small hands, and his heart stopped. The shape of those fingers, the way they moved. He knew those hands. They were his hands, miniature and perfect. Gracia. Her name fell from his lips like a prayer he'd been denied for 18 months. 18 months since his mother had convinced him she'd taken the money. 18 months since he'd believed the lie that had shattered them both. "Hello, Kane." She lifted the baby from the carrier with practiced grace, and suddenly the child was facing him, dark curls, golden skin, and eyes the exact shade of storm gray that stared back at him from mirrors. "I'd like you to meet your son." The room might as well have exploded. Board members pushed back from the table, Victoria's teacup clattered against its saucer, and somewhere in the distance, a phone began ringing unanswered. But all Kane could see was the child, his child, looking at him with curious eyes that held flecks of gold just like Gracia's. "That's impossible." Victoria's voice sliced through his wonder, sharp and cold. "Miss Monroe, I believe you're quite mistaken about." "Am I?" Gracia turned toward the older woman with a smile that could cut glass. "Because I have 18 months' worth of records that say otherwise. Medical records, birth certificates, and a DNA test that I'm sure Kane would be happy to verify." She shifted the baby to her other arm, and the child reached out, tiny fingers opening and closing as if trying to grasp something just out of reach. Kane stood so abruptly his chair rolled backward, hitting the wall with a soft thud. Every step toward them felt like walking through quicksand, his heart hammering against his ribs as he drew closer to the two people who had once been his entire world, and apparently still were. "What's his name?" The words escaped before he could stop them, rough with emotion he'd buried for too long. Gracia's expression softened for just a moment, vulnerability flickering across her features like candlelight. "Isaiah," she whispered. "His name is Isaiah." The baby, Isaiah, turned at the sound of Kane's voice, and when their eyes met, something fundamental shifted in the universe. This was his son, his flesh and blood, looking at him with the same intense curiosity that Gracia had always said would get him into trouble someday. But as Kane reached out, desperate to touch this miracle he'd never known existed, Gracia stepped back, her armor sliding back into place. "Don't," she said quietly, but the word carried the weight of every lie, every sleepless night, every moment she'd faced this alone. "You don't get to just—" "I didn't know," Kane's voice broke. "Gracia, I swear to God, I didn't know." Behind them, Victoria was already reaching for her phone, her fingers flying across the screen with practiced efficiency. But Gracia's laugh was bitter music that drowned out everything else. "Of course you didn't know," she said, her eyes never leaving his face. "Your mother made sure of that, didn't she?" The question hung in the air like smoke, and Kane felt the ground shifting beneath his feet. Whatever game his mother had been playing, whatever web of lies had kept him from this moment, it was about to unravel. And as he stared at the woman he'd never stopped loving and the child he'd never known he had, only one question burned through his mind. How many more secrets were about to destroy them all over again? 2 years earlier, Gracia Monroe had been untouchable. At 26, she'd built Monroe Communications from nothing, a PR empire that could make or break reputations with a single press release. Her corner office overlooked Central Park, her Louboutin collection rivaled small boutiques, and her smile could convince oil executives to invest in solar panels. She'd also been hopelessly, destructively in love with Kane Blackwood. Where Gracia was fire and ambition, Kane was ice and calculation. At 32, He'd inherited Blackwood Industries but had tripled its value through ruthless efficiency and an uncanny ability to predict market trends. He collected vintage watches, drove cars that cost more than most people's houses, and had never met a business deal he couldn't close, except when it came to his heart. Their worlds had collided at a charity gala where Gracia was managing publicity for the event and Kane was the reluctant guest of honor. She'd been arguing with a caterer about champagne placement when he'd appeared beside her, straightening his bow tie with those long, elegant fingers. "The crystal goes on the east wall," he'd said quietly. "Better lighting, and it photographs more impressively for the society pages." She'd turned, ready to tell this presumptuous stranger exactly where he could put his opinions, and had been struck speechless by storm-gray eyes that seemed to see straight through her professional mask to the ambitious girl from Brooklyn who still couldn't quite believe she belonged in these glittering rooms. "You must be Kane Blackwood," she'd managed, extending a hand that he'd held just a moment too long. "And you must be the woman who convinced Senator Richardson to publicly support renewable energy after he'd spent 20 years in Big Oil's pocket." His smile had been slow, devastating. "I've been wanting to meet you." That had been the beginning of everything. 6 months of stolen moments between board meetings and charity events, of discovering that beneath Kane's controlled exterior lived a man who collected first-edition poetry books and who made her laugh until her sides ached, who traced her scars, physical and emotional, with gentle fingers and whispered promises against her skin in the dark. But Gracia should have known that Victoria Blackwood would never allow her son to be with someone like her. Not permanently. Victoria Blackwood was old money wrapped in Chanel suits and cold calculation. At 63, she'd outlasted 3 husbands and countless social rivals through strategic thinking and the ability to identify threats before they became problems. She'd built her life on the principle that breeding mattered, that certain kinds of people belonged in certain places, and that her son's legacy was too important to be jeopardized by inappropriate attachments. Gracia Monroe, brilliant and beautiful as she was, would never be appropriate enough. The first warning had come through social snubs, invitations mysteriously lost, charity committees that suddenly had no openings. Then professional obstacles appeared. Clients who'd worked with Monroe Communications for years suddenly switching firms, permits delayed, key employees poached by competitors. "She's testing you," Gracia's best friend Zara had warned over wine and takeout in Gracia's apartment. "Seeing if you'll crack under pressure." "Let her test," Gracia had replied, curled against Kane's side as he worked on his laptop beside her. "I don't break easily." But Victoria had been playing a longer game. She'd been studying Gracia, learning her weaknesses, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. And when Gracia had discovered she was pregnant, Victoria had found her opening. Now, standing in that boardroom with 18 months of fury burning in her chest and her son sleeping peacefully in her arms, Gracia remembered every sleepless night, every bill she'd paid alone, every moment she'd stared at Isaiah's face and seen the man who'd abandoned them both. Except he hadn't abandoned them. He'd been lied to, manipulated, kept in the dark by the woman now frantically texting on her phone as if she could somehow make this problem disappear. "Gracia." Kane's voice was rough with emotion as he took another step closer. "Please. Let me." "Let you what?" The words came out sharper than she'd intended, and Isaiah stirred against her shoulder. She softened her voice, swaying gently to keep him calm. "Let you explain. Let you pretend you care. Let you break us all over again when your mother decides we're still not good enough." "That's not." Kane ran a hand through his dark hair, the same gesture she'd once found endearing. "I thought you'd taken the money. I thought you'd chosen." "What money?" The question exploded out of her before she could stop it, and suddenly the room felt too small, too hot, too full of secrets that had been festering in the dark for too long. Kane's face went white. Behind him, Victoria had gone very still, her phone forgotten in her manicured hands. "The $2 million, he said slowly, his eyes never leaving Gracia's face. "The check my mother said you'd taken. The one that bought your silence and your disappearance." Gracia felt the world tilt. "I never took any money from your mother. I never even spoke to your mother after that night at the gallery when she told me I was nothing but a temporary distraction." The silence stretched between them like a chasm, filled only by Isaiah's soft breathing and the distant hum of the city beyond the floor-to-ceiling windows. And in that silence, both Kane and Gracia realized they'd been pawns in a game neither of them had known they were playing. Victoria Blackwood cleared her throat. "Perhaps we should discuss this privately." "No." Gracia's voice cut through the older woman's words like a blade. "We've had enough private discussions. We've had enough lies." She turned to face Victoria fully, her chin raised in defiance. "Tell him. Tell him what you really did. The battle lines were drawn. Mother against son. Truth against lies. Love against the kind of calculated cruelty that destroyed lives to preserve legacies. And in the center of it all, Isaiah slept on, unaware that his very existence was about to change everything. The truth, when it came, arrived like a demolition ball through crystal. I protected you, Victoria said finally, her voice steady despite the chaos erupting around her. From a mistake that would have ruined your life, your company, everything we've built. Cain moved so fast that Gracia instinctively stepped back, clutching Isaiah closer. But his fury wasn't directed at them. It was focused entirely on the woman who'd raised him, shaped him, and apparently manipulated him with surgical precision. Protected me. His voice was low, dangerous, the kind of tone that made grown men in three-piece suits reconsider their positions. You made me believe the woman I loved had betrayed me. You made me believe she'd taken money to disappear from my life. Because I knew you'd go after her. Victoria's composure cracked, revealing something raw and desperate underneath. You were already talking about proposing, about changing the company structure to include her input. Do you have any idea what that would have cost us? What it would have looked like to the board, to our shareholders? Gracia felt sick. All those nights she'd wondered if Cain had ever really loved her, if she'd been fooling herself about the connection between them, and he'd been planning to propose. He'd been ready to restructure his empire to make room for her dreams. So you lied to both of us, Cain said, each word precise and cutting. You told me she'd taken money and disappeared. What did you tell her? Victoria's silence stretched too long. When she finally spoke, her voice was smaller, defensive. I told her the truth. That you'd never marry someone like her. That the best she could hope for was to be a mistress, kept on the side while you married someone appropriate. The words hit Gracia like physical blows. She remembered that night at the gallery opening, the way Victoria had appeared beside her like an elegant viper while Cain was across the room speaking with investors. The older woman's soft voice had been filled with venom disguised as kindness. He'll tire of you eventually, dear. Men like Cain always do. But if you're smart, you can make this arrangement profitable for both of you. A generous settlement, a good reference for your business, and the dignity of walking away before he discards you publicly. Gracia had been 6 weeks pregnant then, though she hadn't known it yet. She'd been planning to tell Cain she loved him, had been gathering courage all evening to say the words that had been burning in her chest for months. Instead, she'd left the gallery in tears, gone home, and spent the weekend reconsidering everything she'd thought she knew about their relationship. When Cain had called, she'd been cold, distant, guarded. When he'd pushed for answers, she'd given him partial truths wrapped in protective anger. And when she'd discovered the pregnancy 2 weeks later, she'd already built walls so high that climbing over them felt impossible. You destroyed us, Gracia said, her voice shaking with 18 months of suppressed rage. You destroyed us both, and you stole his son's first year of life, because you couldn't stand the thought of your precious bloodline being contaminated by someone who didn't come from the right family. I did what any mother would do, Victoria snapped, her mask finally slipping completely. I protected my son's future. No, Cain's voice was deadly quiet. You destroyed it. He turned to Gracia then, and she saw something in his eyes she'd never seen before, not just anger, but a kind of focused determination that made her pulse race. This was the man who'd built an empire, who'd never lost a battle that mattered to him. And apparently, she mattered. Gracia. He stopped just out of reach, his hands open at his sides in a gesture of supplication. I know I don't deserve it. I know I've lost the right to ask. But please, give me a chance to fix this. Give me a chance to be the man you deserved then, the father Isaiah deserves now. Isaiah chose that moment to wake up, blinking sleepy gray eyes at the man he'd never met. And perhaps it was coincidence, or perhaps children simply knew things that adults had forgotten. But he reached out with one tiny fist, fingers opening toward Cain like a flower seeking sunlight. Gracia's breath caught. For 18 months, she'd imagined this moment, had dreaded it, longed for it, tried to prepare for it. She'd imagined anger, coldness, even indifference. She hadn't prepared for the way Cain's face transformed when their son reached for him, hadn't expected the tears that gathered in those storm-gray eyes, hadn't anticipated how her own heart would crack wide open at the sight of two parts of her soul recognizing each other. He has your eyes, she whispered, the words escaping before she could stop them. He has your strength, Cain replied, his voice rough with wonder. Look at the way he holds his head. The way he's studying everything. He's fearless. Behind them, Victoria was gathering her things with sharp, efficient movements, but neither of them noticed. The entire world had narrowed to this triangle of connection, mother, father, child, that felt as inevitable as gravity and twice as powerful. What happens now? Gracia asked, because someone had to break the spell before she did something stupid like believe in fairy tales again. Kane met her eyes over Isaiah's head. Now I spend however long it takes proving to both of you that I'm worth a second chance. That we're worth fighting for. And if your mother tries to interfere again. The smile that spread across Kane's face was sharp enough to cut diamonds. My mother is about to discover that destroying my family was the biggest mistake she's ever made. And I don't make the same mistake twice. It wasn't a promise of happily ever after. It was something better. It was a declaration of war against everything that had kept them apart, and a commitment to fight for the love they'd never really lost. As Victoria's heels clicked toward the door, defeated for the first time in her calculating life, Gracia felt something shift inside her chest. Not forgiveness, that would take time. Not trust, that would have to be rebuilt brick by careful brick. But hope. Fragile, dangerous, absolutely terrifying hope. One chance, she heard herself say. You get one chance, Kane Blackwood. Don't waste it. His answer was in the way he looked at her, in the reverent care with which he finally, carefully, touched their son's tiny hand. The war for their family had just begun. 3 weeks later, Gracia's carefully constructed defenses were under siege. It started with the flowers, not the ostentatious arrangements she'd expected from a billionaire trying to buy forgiveness, but small, thoughtful gestures that showed he'd been paying attention. White peonies for her office because she'd once mentioned they reminded her of her grandmother's garden. Yellow roses for Isaiah's nursery because, as Kane's handwritten note explained, they symbolized new beginnings and joy. Then came the practical support that she hadn't asked for but desperately needed. A pediatrician who made house calls appeared at her door, recommended by a mutual friend who happened to be the best children's doctor in the city. Her building's maintenance issues, the broken elevator, the temperamental heating, were mysteriously resolved within days. Her car, which had been making concerning noises for months, was replaced by a family-safe SUV with a note that simply read, Isaiah's safety isn't negotiable. See? But it was the smaller moments that were destroying her resolve. Like the evening she'd opened her door to find Kane sitting in the hallway, his back against the wall and his expensive suit wrinkled from a long day. He'd been holding a bag of takeout from the Thai place they used to love, and when she'd asked how long he'd been waiting, he'd simply said, however long it takes. They'd eaten in careful silence while Isaiah played on his blanket between them, both of them hyper-aware of every accidental touch, every shared glance. When Kane had quietly started assembling the new high chair he'd brought without being asked, Gracia had felt something dangerous flutter in her chest. You don't have to do this, she'd said, watching him work with the same focused intensity he'd once brought to board meetings. Yes, I do. He hadn't looked up from the instruction manual. I missed his first smile, his first time rolling over, his first tooth. I'm not missing anything else. The raw honesty in his voice had nearly undone her. But it was Zara who'd forced her to confront what she was really afraid of. His trying, her best friend had said over coffee while Isaiah napped in his stroller. I mean, really trying. Not just throwing money at the problem, but actually showing up. I know. Gracia had traced patterns in the foam of her latte, unwilling to meet Zara's knowing eyes. So what's the problem? Because 6 months ago, you were crying into ice cream wishing he'd come back. Now he's here, he's fighting for you, and you're acting like it's an inconvenience. Because it is an inconvenience. The words had burst out of her, too loud for the quiet cafe. She'd lowered her voice, glancing around apologetically. Zara, I built a life without him. I learned how to be a single mother, how to run my business and raise my son and not need anyone. I'm strong now. I'm independent. I'm terrified. The word had hit like a slap. Gracia had opened her mouth to argue, then closed it again because denial would have been pointless. Zara had known her too long, seen through too many of her masks. What if I let him in and he breaks us again? She'd whispered. What if his mother finds another way to destroy this? What if I'm not enough to keep him interested once the novelty wears off? What if you're exactly enough? Zara had interrupted gently. What if he's learned from his mistakes? What if love is worth the risk? That conversation had been 3 days ago, and Gracia hadn't been able to stop thinking about it. Especially not when Kane continued his quiet campaign to prove himself worthy of their trust. Like tonight, when she'd come home from a disastrous client meeting to find him reading to Isaiah in the nursery. He'd been sitting in the rocking chair she'd assembled alone during her 8th month of pregnancy, his deep voice soft as he read from a picture book about dragons and brave knights. Isaiah had been transfixed, his tiny hands reaching toward the colorful pages while his father's voice painted stories of adventure and magic. "How did you get in?" she'd asked from the doorway, though her building's security was notoriously tight. "Mrs. Chen downstairs let me in. Apparently, Isaiah and I passed her grandmother test." He'd glanced up with a smile that made her stomach flip. She said any man who brings a baby books instead of toys is probably worth keeping around. "You brought books?" 23 of them. I may have gone overboard at the bookstore." He'd gestured toward a corner where shopping bags sat overflowing with picture books, board books, and what looked like an entire children's library. "I realized I don't know what he likes yet. So I bought everything." The vulnerability in his admission had nearly brought her to her knees. This powerful man, who commanded boardrooms and negotiated million-dollar deals, was nervous about choosing the right books for his son. "He likes the ones with bright pictures," she'd offered quietly. "And anything with animals. Especially elephants." Cain had immediately reached for a book about a baby elephant learning to paint, and Isaiah had clapped his hands in delight. The sound had made Cain's face light up like she'd given him the world's greatest gift. Now, watching them together, Gracia felt her walls crumbling. Isaiah was relaxed in his father's arms in a way that spoke to some deep, genetic recognition. And Cain, controlled, calculating Cain, was completely undone by every gurgle, every yawn, every sleepy smile. "He's getting heavy," she said softly. "I can put him down for his nap." "Can I?" Cain asked, and there was something almost shy in the question. "I've never. I'd like to try." She showed him how to lower Isaiah into his crib without waking him, how to turn on the mobile that played soft lullabies, how to adjust the blackout curtains to create the perfect sleeping environment. Cain followed her instructions with the same meticulous attention he'd once given to merger documents, and when Isaiah settled with a contented sigh, the wonder on his face was almost too intimate to witness. They stood side by side in the doorway, watching their son sleep, and Gracia was acutely aware of the warmth radiating from Cain's body, the familiar scent of his cologne, the way her shoulder almost brushed his arm. "Thank you," he said quietly. "For this. For letting me be here. I'm not sure I had a choice." She'd meant it lightly, but there was too much truth in the words. He turned to face her fully, and suddenly they were too close. Close enough that she could see the flecks of silver in his gray eyes, could count the lines that hadn't been there 18 months ago. "You always have a choice, Gracia. That's what I'm trying to prove. And what if I choose wrong again?" The question escaped before she could stop it, raw and honest in the dim hallway. His hand came up slowly, giving her time to pull away, before his fingers traced the line of her cheek with heartbreaking gentleness. "Then we figure it out together. All three of us." The kiss was inevitable. Soft, careful, full of 18 months of longing and regret and desperate hope. It tasted like coming home and like falling off a cliff at the same time. And when they broke apart, Gracia was breathing like she'd run a marathon. "This is crazy," she whispered against his lips. "Completely," he agreed, but he didn't step back, didn't let go of her face like she was something precious and fragile. "Your mother will never accept this. My mother doesn't get a vote anymore. The press will have a field day when they find out. Let them." His thumb traced across her bottom lip, and she shivered. "I don't care about any of it, Gracia. Not the scandal, not the board, not the stock prices. I care about you. I care about Isaiah. I care about the family I was too blind to fight for the first time." She wanted to believe him. God, she wanted to believe him so badly it physically hurt. But 18 months of single motherhood, of sleepless nights and lonely decisions and the constant ache of missing him, had taught her to protect herself. "I need time," she said, hating how her voice shook. "I need to know this isn't just guilt, or some kind of midlife crisis, or—" "It's love," he interrupted, and the simple certainty in his voice stopped her protests cold. "It's always been love, Gracia. Even when I thought you'd betrayed me, even when I tried to hate you, even when I convinced myself I was better off without you. It's always been love." The words hung between them like a bridge, beautiful, tempting, and terrifying to cross. Because loving Cain Blackwood had nearly destroyed her once, and she wasn't sure she was strong enough to survive it a second time. But looking at him now, seeing the man who'd spent 3 weeks proving his devotion not with grand gestures but with quiet consistency, She realized she might not have a choice. She was already falling. The only question was whether he'd be there to catch her this time. Part 5. The Midpoint Revelation. The revelation came through Isaiah, as the most important truths often did through children who saw the world without filters or fear. It was a Saturday morning, 6 weeks after Gracia's dramatic appearance in the boardroom. She'd finally agreed to let Kane take Isaiah to the park alone, a monumental step that had required 3 phone calls to her pediatrician, a detailed safety briefing, and the installation of a GPS tracker on the diaper bag. She'd been using the time to catch up on work, but found herself checking her phone every 10 minutes for updates. When it buzzed with an incoming video call, she nearly knocked over her coffee in her haste to answer. "Everything okay?" she said breathlessly, but the screen showed Isaiah's delighted face as he swung in a baby swing, his laughter carrying through the speaker like pure joy. "Say hi to Mama." Kane's voice came from behind the camera, and Isaiah clapped his hands, babbling in the complex language that only babies understood. "He's been laughing non-stop," Kane said, turning the camera to include himself in the frame. His hair was mussed, his expensive jacket discarded somewhere, and he looked happier than she'd seen him in years. "I think he likes the swings." "He loves them," Gracia confirmed, her heart doing complicated things at the sight of them together. "But don't push him too high, and make sure the straps are tight but not restrictive, checked every 5 minutes, and no more than 15 minutes at a time before a break," Kane recited with gentle amusement. "Gracia, I memorized your entire safety manual." "He's fine. We're fine." She was about to respond when a woman's voice interrupted from off-camera. "Excuse me, are you Kane Blackwood?" The camera wavered as Kane turned, and Gracia caught a glimpse of an elegant woman in her 40s pushing a stroller. "Yes, I am." "I thought so. I'm Jennifer Hartwell. My husband is on the board at Roosevelt Children's Hospital. We've met at several charity events." The woman's smile was bright, curious. "I didn't know you had a son. He's absolutely gorgeous." Gracia felt her stomach drop. This was exactly what she'd been afraid of. The moment when their private struggle became public entertainment, when Isaiah became the subject of society gossip and speculation. But Kane's response surprised her. "Thank you," he said simply, his voice warm with unmistakable pride. "This is Isaiah. He's 14 months old and currently the most important person in my life. He looks just like you. Those Blackwood eyes are unmistakable. And is his mother?" There was a pause, and Gracia held her breath. This was the moment. This was where Kane would either claim them publicly or find some way to deflect, to keep their relationship ambiguous enough to preserve his reputation. "His mother is Gracia Monroe," Kane said clearly, and there was something fierce in his voice. "She's brilliant, beautiful, and the strongest woman I've ever known. She built an incredible business from nothing, raised our son as a single mother when I was too blind to see what was right in front of me, and somehow found it in her heart to give me a second chance I definitely don't deserve." The camera had found Isaiah again, but Gracia could hear the woman's sharp intake of breath. "Oh, how lovely. I had no idea you were dating anyone." "We have a complicated history," Kane admitted. "But we're working on our future. All 3 of us." There was more polite conversation, but Gracia barely heard it. She was staring at the screen where Isaiah was reaching towards something off-camera, his face lighting up with recognition and joy. When Kane's face appeared in the frame again, she could see her son's tiny hand patting his cheek with the proprietary affection of a child who'd already chosen his favorite person. "Dada," Isaiah said clearly, his first real word captured on video for posterity. The silence stretched for several heartbeats. Then Kane's voice, rough with emotion. "Did he just?" "Dada," Isaiah repeated, more insistently this time, as if he'd been practicing and was proud to finally get it right. Gracia watched Kane's face transform, watched 18 months of grief and regret and desperate love crystallize into something transcendent. He lifted Isaiah from the swing with shaking hands, holding him close as their son chatted happily, occasionally throwing in another proud dada for good measure. "Gracia," Kane's voice was barely steady. "Did you hear?" "I heard," she whispered, tears blurring her vision. She'd been waiting for Isaiah's first word for months, had fantasized about the moment he'd call her Mima with clear intention. She hadn't expected his first word to be for the father who'd been absent for most of his life, and she definitely hadn't expected it to feel like a gift instead of a loss. "I'm sorry," Kane said immediately, understanding her silence. "I know you wanted his first word to be perfect," she interrupted, her voice thick with emotion. "I wanted his first word to be perfect. And it was. Because watching Isaiah choose his father, watching him claim Cain with the absolute certainty of a child who knew he was loved, was perfect. It was healing something in all three of them that had been broken for too long. When they came home an hour later, Isaiah was asleep in his car seat, exhausted from his adventure. Cain carried him upstairs with the careful reverence of a man holding his most precious treasure, and Gracia found herself watching them both with a sense of rightness she hadn't felt in nearly 2 years. "He called me Dada," Cain said softly as they settled Isaiah in his crib. There was still wonder in his voice, as if he couldn't quite believe it had happened. "He's a smart boy," Gracia replied. "He knows his father when he sees him. Even when his father is an idiot who nearly lost everything that mattered." She turned to face him fully, studying the man who'd somehow become both familiar and foreign over these past weeks. The structure of his face was the same, the storm-gray eyes unchanged, but there was something deeper now, a gravity that spoke of hard lessons learned and priorities realigned. "You didn't lose us," she said quietly. "We're still here." "Are we?" The question was vulnerable, hopeful, terrified. "Are we really here, Gracia? Or are we just playing house until you decide I can't be trusted with your hearts?" It was the question she'd been avoiding, the fear that lived at the center of all her careful walls. But looking at him now, seeing the man who'd spent 6 weeks proving his devotion in 100 small ways, who'd claimed them publicly without hesitation, who'd cried when their son called him Dada, she realized the answer had been growing inside her all along. "We're here," she said, stepping closer until she could touch his face, until she could trace the lines of exhaustion and hope and desperate love. "We're scared, and we're damaged, and we have a lot of work ahead of us. But we're here, Cain. All three of us." His kiss was different this time, not careful or questioning, but claiming. His hands framed her face as he poured 18 months of longing into the space between them, and when they finally broke apart, both of them were breathing hard. "I love you," he said against her lips. "I never stopped loving you, not for a single day." "I know," she whispered back, and for the first time in 18 months, she felt complete. "I love you too." It wasn't just forgiveness, it was recognition. Recognition that they were stronger now, wiser, more aware of how precious and fragile love could be. Recognition that Isaiah had given them something neither of them had expected, a second chance to build something better than what they'd lost. And for the first time since that night in the gallery, Gracia allowed herself to believe in forever. Victoria Blackwood had not built an empire by accepting defeat gracefully. The first sign of trouble came 3 days after Isaiah's public debut as a Blackwood heir. Gracia was reviewing contracts in her office when her assistant knocked urgently on the door. "There's a woman here to see you," Jenny said, her voice tight with concern. "She says she's from Child Protective Services." The blood drained from Gracia's face. "What?" "Ms. Monroe." A stern-faced woman in her 50s appeared behind Jenny, her expression professionally neutral. "I'm Patricia Wells from CPS. We've received some concerning reports about the welfare of a child in your care. I need to conduct a home visit immediately." Gracia's hands went numb. "What kind of reports?" "Allegations of endangerment, negligent supervision, and questions about the fitness of individuals who have access to the child." The woman's tone was clinical, but Gracia could hear the implied threat beneath every word. "I'll need to examine your living situation and interview all parties involved in the child's care." The next 4 hours were a nightmare of invasive questions, photographed bruises from normal toddler activities, and careful documentation of every aspect of Isaiah's life. The social worker examined his nursery with forensic attention, questioned Gracia about her work schedule, her childcare arrangements, her relationship with Cain. "There are concerns about exposing the child to unstable romantic relationships," Patricia Wells noted, making marks on her clipboard. "Reports suggest the father was absent for the first 14 months of the child's life and has only recently become involved." "That's," Gracia began, but the woman held up a hand. "We also have reports of the child being left in the care of an individual with no established parenting experience, potentially dangerous situations involving public exposure, and questions about your ability to provide appropriate supervision while maintaining a demanding career." Every word felt like a physical blow. Someone had been watching them, documenting their every interaction, twisting moments of joy into evidence of negligence. Someone who knew enough about their situation to make the allegations sound plausible. Someone like Victoria Blackwood. When Cain arrived, summoned by Gracia's frantic phone call, his face went white at the sight of the CPS investigator taking notes in his son's nursery. "What the hell is this?" he demanded, but Gracia caught his arm before he could say something that would make everything worse. "Mr. Blackwood, I presume." Patricia Wells looked up from her clipboard with professional interest. "I have some questions for you as well." The interrogation that followed was surgical in its precision. Questions about Kane's long work hours, his inexperience with childcare, his family's history of inappropriate relationships with staff. Questions about whether he was truly committed to fatherhood or simply trying to avoid a scandal. Questions that painted him as either absent or opportunistic, with no middle ground for the truth. By the time the social worker left, promising a full report within 72 hours and warning them that temporary custody arrangements might need to be made for the child's protection, both Kane and Gracia were shaking with suppressed rage and terror. "This is her," Gracia said when the door finally closed behind Patricia Wells. "This is your mother's revenge." Kane was pacing like a caged animal, his usual control shattered completely. "I'll kill her. I swear to God, I'll." "You'll do nothing that gives them more ammunition," Gracia interrupted sharply. "Don't you understand? This is exactly what she wants. She wants you angry, reckless, out of control. She wants us fighting each other instead of fighting her. Then what do we do?" He spun to face her, his eyes blazing with helpless fury. "How do we fight someone who's willing to weaponize child protective services to get what she wants?" Before Gracia could answer, her phone rang. Victoria Blackwood's name appeared on the screen, and for a moment, both of them just stared at it. "Answer it," Kane said grimly. "Let's hear what she has to say for herself." Gracia put the call on speaker, her voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through her veins. "Mrs. Blackwood." "Ms. Monroe." Victoria's voice was silk over steel. "I understand you've had some visitors today. If you mean the CPS investigator you sicked on us, then yes. I'm sure I don't know what you mean." The innocent tone was masterfully crafted. "Though I have heard some concerning rumors about my grandson's living situation. A responsible grandmother would naturally want to ensure his safety." Kane stepped closer to the phone, his voice deadly quiet. "What do you want?" "I want what's best for my family," Victoria replied smoothly. "What I've always wanted. A legitimate heir raised with proper values, appropriate education, and the kind of stability that only comes from established social connections." "You want custody," Gracia said flatly. "I want what's right. A child deserves two parents who are married, committed to each other, and prepared to provide a stable home environment. Not a single mother with a demanding career and a man who's playing house to assuage his guilt." The words hit their target with precision accuracy. Every insecurity Gracia had buried, every fear she'd tried to overcome, suddenly felt exposed and raw. "We're working things out," Kane said, but there was something hollow in his voice that made Gracia's stomach clench. "Are you?" Victoria's laugh was musical and cruel. "From what I understand, you're not even living together. You have no legal relationship to the child or his mother. You've made no permanent commitments, no binding arrangements. Tell me, Kane, what happens when the novelty wears off? When maintaining two households becomes inconvenient? When the board starts asking questions about your judgment and priorities?" Each question landed like a blow, because they were all variations of the fears that kept Gracia awake at 3 a.m. What if this was temporary? What if Kane was just playing at being a father until the reality became too difficult? What if she was setting herself and Isaiah up for another devastating abandonment? "That's not," Kane began, but Victoria cut him off. "You have 48 hours to make your decision," she said crisply. "Either you do what's right and provide Isaiah with a legitimate family, marriage, shared household, proper legal protections, or I'll ensure that CPS finds sufficient cause to recommend alternative arrangements. I've already identified several excellent families who would be thrilled to raise a Blackwood heir with appropriate values." The line went dead, leaving them staring at each other across a suddenly enormous chasm. "She's bluffing," Kane said immediately. "She can't actually." "She can." Gracia's voice was dead, defeated. "She's Victoria Blackwood. She has money, connections, and a legitimate concern for her grandson's welfare. I'm a single mother who's been raising a child alone while building a business. She's already planted seeds of doubt with CPS, and if we don't present a united front, a legitimate family unit, she'll use our uncertainty against us. Then we get married." The words burst out of Kane before he could stop them. "Tomorrow. Today. We give her what she wants." Gracia looked at him for a long moment, seeing the panic in his eyes, the desperate calculation. "You want to marry me to spite your mother. I want to marry you to protect our family." That's not the same thing as wanting to marry me, Kane. The silence stretched between them, filled with all the words they couldn't say, all the feelings they couldn't trust. Outside, Isaiah was napping peacefully, unaware that his entire future hung in the balance of his parents' fears. What if she's right? Gracia whispered finally. What if this is just guilt and good intentions? What if 6 months from now, you wake up and realize you married me for all the wrong reasons? What if I don't? He countered, but there was something fragile in his voice that betrayed his own doubts. What if you do? They stared at each other across the wreckage of their hopes, and Gracia realized that Victoria had won the most crucial battle without firing a single shot. She'd turned their love into a weakness, their commitment into a question, their future into a trap. Because now, no matter what they chose, they'd always wonder if they'd done it for the right reasons, or if they'd simply been backed into a corner by a woman who understood exactly how to destroy the thing she couldn't control. The darkness closing around them wasn't just Victoria's machinations. It was doubt, fear, and the terrible possibility that love might not be enough to save them after all. Part 7. The Turning Point. The answer came from the most unexpected source, Isaiah himself. It was 2 a.m. when Gracia heard him crying, not his usual sleepy fussing, but the sharp, distressed wail that meant something was wrong. She rushed to his room to find him burning with fever, his small body limp and overheated in her arms. Her hands shook as she took his temperature, 104.2 degrees Fahrenheit. "Oh God, baby, oh God," she whispered, her nurse training kicking in even as panic threatened to overwhelm her. Febrile seizures, brain damage, all the terrifying possibilities that every parent knew but tried never to think about. She called 911 with one hand while stripping Isaiah of his pajamas with the other, her voice somehow steady as she gave the dispatcher their address. Then, without really deciding to, she called Kane. He answered on the first ring, his voice instantly alert despite the hour. "Gracia. Isaiah's sick." The words came out broken, desperate. "High fever. I called an ambulance, but I need you. I'm already in the car." He beat the ambulance by 3 minutes, arriving in sweats and a hastily thrown-on jacket, his hair wild from sleep and his face white with terror. He took one look at Isaiah's flushed, listless form in Gracia's arms and something shifted in his expression, all pretense falling away, leaving only raw, primal love. "How high?" he asked, gently touching Isaiah's forehead. "Almost 104. His not responding normally, and her voice broke. "Kane, I'm scared." "He's going to be okay," he said with fierce certainty, pulling both of them into his arms. "We're going to make sure he's okay." The ride to the hospital was a blur of sirens and medical terminology, of Kane holding Gracia while she held Isaiah, both of them whispering prayers to gods they weren't sure they believed in. In the emergency room, they moved as a unit, Gracia translating medical jargon for Kane handling insurance and paperwork while Gracia never left Isaiah's side. Hours passed. For fluids, cooling blankets, a battery of tests to rule out meningitis and other terrifying possibilities. Isaiah remained listless and feverish, barely responsive except to whimper when the nurses had to draw more blood. It was dawn when Dr. Martinez finally emerged with results and reassurances. "It's just a particularly nasty viral infection," she said gently. "His fever should break within the next day or two. He'll be uncomfortable, but he's going to be fine." The relief was so overwhelming that Gracia actually swayed on her feet. Kane caught her, holding her steady as 6 hours of suppressed terror finally found release in shaking sobs. "He's okay," Kane whispered against her hair, and she realized he was crying too. "Our boy is okay." They took Isaiah home with medication and instructions, both of them exhausted but unwilling to leave his side. Kane called in sick to work, something he'd never done in 15 years of running the company, while Gracia cancelled all her meetings. They took turns monitoring his temperature, coaxing him to drink fluids, holding him when he cried. It was during one of those endless, quiet hours, with Isaiah finally sleeping peacefully between them on the couch, that Gracia realized something fundamental had changed. "Your mother called," she said softly, nodding toward her silenced phone on the coffee table. 3 times. I'm sure she heard about the hospital visit." Kane's jaw tightened, but he didn't look away from Isaiah's sleeping face. "Let her call." "Kane." "No." His voice was quiet but absolutely firm. "I don't care what she wants. I don't care about her ultimatums or her threats or her plans for our son's future. The only thing that matters is this, the 3 of us, taking care of each other." Gracia studied his profile in the dim afternoon light filtering through the curtains. What about the CPS investigation? What about legitimacy and proper families and all the things she said we need to give Isaiah? We are a proper family. He turned to meet her eyes, and she saw something there she'd never seen before, absolute certainty. Not because we have a marriage certificate or because we live in the same house or because we check all the boxes on someone else's list. We're a family because when our son was sick, there was nowhere else either of us wanted to be. Because we've spent 18 months hurting for each other even when we thought we hated each other. Because I would rather fight the whole world with you than have peace without you. The words hung in the air between them, simple and true and terrifying in their honesty. The marriage proposal, Gracia said carefully. Yesterday, when you said. I said it for the wrong reasons, Kane interrupted. I said it because I was scared and desperate and trying to protect us from my mother. But that's not why I want to marry you, Gracia. No. He shifted carefully, trying not to disturb Isaiah, until he was facing her fully. I want to marry you because when I hold you, it feels like coming home. I want to marry you because you're the strongest person I know, and somehow you make me stronger too. I want to marry you because our son has your eyes and my stubbornness, and when he smiles, it's like seeing our souls reflected back at us. His voice grew rough with emotion. I want to marry you because I love you, not because I have to, but because I can't imagine loving anyone else. Tears were sliding down Gracia's cheeks, but she was smiling. That's a much better proposal. Is it good enough for a yes? She looked down at Isaiah, sleeping peacefully between them, his fever finally breaking as color returned to his cheeks. She thought about the fear that had consumed her just hours ago, the terrible possibility of losing him, and how the only person she'd wanted by her side was the man sitting across from her now. She thought about Victoria's threats and ultimatums, about CPS investigations and public scrutiny and all the ways their love could be weaponized against them. Then she thought about Kane rushing to the hospital in the middle of the night, about the way he'd held them both while they waited for news, about the absolute certainty in his voice when he'd said their boy would be okay. Yes, she whispered, and the word felt like a prayer, like a promise, like coming home after a very long journey. Yes, Kane. I'll marry you. He kissed her then, careful not to wake their sleeping son, and it tasted like hope and healing and the kind of love that could survive anything, even Victoria Blackwood's worst machinations. Outside, storm clouds were gathering, but inside their small circle of warmth and light, Gracia finally understood what Kane had been trying to tell her. They were already everything they needed to be. The war wasn't over, but they'd remembered how to fight it together. Part 8, Climactic Resolution. The wedding took place 3 days later in the hospital chapel where they'd spent that terrifying night, with Isaiah gurgling happily in Gracia's arms as they exchanged vows. It wasn't the grand society affair Victoria would have orchestrated, but it was theirs, intimate, honest, and unshakable. Victoria's response was swift and predictable. You think a hasty ceremony changes anything? Her voice was ice-cold when she called that evening. You think I can't see through this transparent attempt to legitimize an unsuitable arrangement? I think, Kane said calmly, that you've overplayed your hand. Have I? Patricia Wells is still conducting her investigation. There are still questions about fitness and stability. A marriage certificate doesn't erase 18 months of abandonment. No, Kane agreed. But it does provide some interesting legal protections. And it gave me the standing I needed to file a few motions of my own. The silence on the other end stretched long enough that Gracia looked up from feeding Isaiah, curious about what had rendered Victoria speechless. What motions? Victoria's voice was carefully controlled, but Gracia caught the edge of uncertainty beneath. A restraining order, for starters, Kane said conversationally. Harassment, intimidation, malicious use of government agencies. My lawyers were quite creative in their language. Then there's the civil suit, conspiracy, intentional infliction of emotional distress, alienation of affection. The damages we're seeking are substantial. You wouldn't dare. I would. I have. The papers were filed this morning. His voice hardened. But more importantly, I've called a board meeting for Monday morning. It seems some interesting information has come to light about the financial irregularities in the foundation accounts you've been managing. Nothing illegal, of course, but definitely worth discussing with the ethics committee. Gracia felt a cold smile spread across her face. She'd forgotten how dangerous Kane could be when someone threatened his family. He'd spent the past 2 months showing Victoria his love and vulnerability. Now she was seeing his other side, the ruthless businessman who'd never lost a war that mattered. You're bluffing, Victoria said, but there was no conviction in her words. Am I? Ask your accountant. Ask your lawyer. Ask anyone you've been working with to manufacture evidence against my wife and son." The possessive way he said my wife sent warmth spiraling through Gracia's chest. "You made one crucial mistake, Mother. You taught me too well." "Kane, I'm not finished." His voice was deadly quiet now. "Here's what's going to happen. You're going to call Patricia Wells and explain that the concerns you raised were based on incomplete information. You're going to publicly apologize to my wife for any misunderstandings. And you're going to stay the hell away from my family. And if I don't, then you'll discover that I learned more from you than just business tactics. I learned how to dismantle someone's entire life piece by careful piece. The difference is, I only use those skills on people who threaten the people I love." There was another long silence, and when Victoria spoke again, her voice was different, smaller, older, almost frightened. "You would really destroy your own mother for her?" "No," Kane said simply. "I would protect my family from anyone who tries to harm them. Even you." The call ended without another word, and Gracia stared at her husband with new understanding. This was what Victoria had never grasped, that love didn't make Kane weak. It made him absolutely unstoppable. "Will she back down?" Gracia asked. "She'll back down." He came to sit beside them, gently stroking Isaiah's cheek as their son finished his bottle. "She's many things, but she's not stupid. She knows when she's beaten. And the CPS investigation will mysteriously conclude that the initial complaints were unfounded." His smile was sharp as a blade. Amazing how quickly government efficiency improves when the right people make the right phone calls. Gracia leaned against his shoulder, marveling at how safe she felt for the first time in 2 years. "I'm sorry it came to this. I know she's still your mother." "She stopped being my mother the moment she tried to keep me from my son," Kane replied, and there was finality in his voice that closed the door on 18 months of manipulation and lies. Family isn't about blood or breeding or maintaining the right social connections. It's about showing up when it matters, protecting the people you love, and choosing each other every day. As if to emphasize his point, Isaiah reached up with both hands, making grabbing motions until Kane lifted him into his arms. Their son immediately settled against his father's chest with a contented sigh, completely trusting in a way that spoke of bonds that went deeper than DNA. "Dada," Isaiah said happily, patting Kane's cheek with sticky fingers. "That's right, buddy," Kane murmured, pressing a kiss to his son's curls. "I'm your daddy, and I'm never going anywhere again." Gracia watched them together, her husband and her son, both of them pieces of her heart walking around outside her body, and felt something settle into place inside her chest. Not just love, though there was plenty of that. Not just relief, though Victoria's defeat had lifted a weight she'd been carrying for months. It was recognition. Recognition that they'd built something stronger than what they'd lost, something that could weather any storm because it was founded on truth instead of fantasy, on choice instead of circumstance. "I love you," she said softly, and Kane looked up with a smile that lit up his entire face. "I love you too, Mrs. Blackwood." The title still felt new, foreign, but in the best possible way. "Both of you. Forever." Outside, the sun was setting over the city they'd both called home for years but which had never felt like home until this moment. Inside, their small family was complete, unbreakable, and ready for whatever came next. The war was over. Love had won. 1 year later, the photography studio buzzed with controlled chaos as stylists adjusted lighting and makeup artists touched up already perfect faces. Gracia sat in the makeup chair, watching in the mirror as professionals transformed her into a glossy magazine version of herself, but her attention was focused on the corner where Kane was helping Isaiah practice walking between 2 chairs. "Mama, look," Isaiah called out, letting go of one chair to clap his hands before promptly sitting down hard on his padded bottom. At 2 years old, he was all determination and dimpled smiles, with Kane's storm-gray eyes and Gracia's stubborn chin. "I saw, baby," she called back, her heart doing that now familiar flip it always did when she watched her boys together. "You're so brave. He's going to be running before we know it," the photographer said, adjusting her camera settings. "This is for the Power Couples issue of Forbes, right? The story about building business empires while raising the next generation." "Something like that." Gracia's smile was soft as she watched Kane scoop Isaiah up for a hug, both of them dissolving into giggles that echoed through the studio. The past year had been a whirlwind of changes, all of them good. Monroe Communications had expanded internationally, with Kane's business expertise helping Gracia navigate global markets she'd only dreamed of reaching before. Blackwood Industries had pivoted toward sustainable technology, with Gracia's PR genius helping them rebrand as forward-thinking innovators rather than old-money traditionalists. But the biggest change was the house in Connecticut, a sprawling property with enough room for Isaiah to run, gardens where Gracia could grow the vegetables her grandmother had taught her to love, and a home office where she and Kane could work side by side when their schedules allowed. Victoria had kept her word, though the peace between them remained fragile. She sent expensive gifts for Isaiah's birthday and Christmas, always accompanied by formally polite notes that never quite acknowledged Gracia as anything more than a temporary addition to the family tree. But she'd stopped actively trying to destroy their happiness, which Gracia counted as progress. "Ready for the family shots?" the photographer asked, and suddenly the controlled chaos shifted focus. Gracia joined her husband and son on the elegant white backdrop, Kane's arm around her waist while Isaiah sat on his hip, chewing thoughtfully on his own fingers. The camera clicked rapidly, capturing moments of genuine laughter as Isaiah grabbed for the bright lights, tried to eat Gracia's earrings, and generally charmed everyone in the room with his fearless exploration of his environment. "Can we get one with Mom and Dad looking at each other instead of the camera?" the photographer suggested. "Something more intimate." Gracia turned toward Kane, and time seemed to slow. He was looking at her the way he had on their wedding day, the way he had in the hospital when Isaiah was sick, the way he did every morning when he brought her coffee before she was fully awake, like she was a miracle he couldn't quite believe was his. "What are you thinking about?" she murmured, aware that the camera was capturing whatever was happening between them but not caring. "The night we met," he said softly. "How you told that caterer exactly where to put the champagne display, and I thought I'd never seen anyone so beautiful in my life. You thought I was bossy. I thought you were magnificent." His free hand came up to trace the line of her cheek. "I still do." The camera kept clicking, but Gracia had forgotten they weren't alone. "I was so scared," she admitted. "When I walked into that boardroom 18 months ago. Scared you'd reject Isaiah, scared you'd try to take him away, scared you'd break us both all over again." "Never," Kane said fiercely. "Never again, Gracia. Whatever happens, whatever challenges we face them together." Isaiah chose that moment to lean forward and plant a slobbery kiss on his mother's cheek, making everyone in the studio laugh. But when Gracia looked back at Kane, his expression was serious, intense. "I have something for you," he said quietly, shifting Isaiah to one arm so he could reach into his jacket pocket. "Kane, we agreed no more jewelry until..." She stopped talking when she saw what he was holding. Not a jewelry box, but a legal document with official-looking seals and signatures. "Monroe Blackwood Communications," she read aloud, her voice catching. "Joint ownership, equal partnership." She looked up at him with wide eyes. "You're giving me half of Blackwood Industries." "I'm acknowledging what was always true," he corrected gently. "You've been my partner in everything that matters for 2 years now. It's time the paperwork caught up with reality." Taze threatened to ruin her carefully applied makeup, but Gracia didn't care. This wasn't just about business or money or legal protections. This was about trust, about true partnership, about a man who'd learned from his mother's mistakes and chosen to build something entirely different. "Are you sure?" she whispered. "Because once you sign those papers, you're stuck with me. In business, in life, in whatever crazy adventure comes next." "Gracia." He leaned closer, until their foreheads were touching and Isaiah was giggling at being squished between them. "I've been stuck on you since the moment you told me where to put the champagne. Everything else is just paperwork." The kiss was soft, sweet, witnessed by a room full of strangers but somehow still intimate. When they broke apart, Isaiah was clapping his hands in delight, as if he understood that something important had just happened. "Mama. Dada," he announced proudly, pointing back and forth between them as if he'd invented the concept of parents. "That's right, baby," Gracia laughed, accepting the tissue someone handed her to dab at her eyes. "Your mama and daddy are a team." "Speaking of which," Kane said, producing another document from his seemingly endless pockets, "I have one more surprise." This time it was adoption papers, legal documents that would make Gracia's parental rights unshakable, that would ensure no one could ever again question Isaiah's place in their family. "In case anyone ever tries to suggest again that we're not a real family," Kane explained, but his voice was rough with emotion. Gracia couldn't speak around the lump in her throat. She thought about that terrifying night with the CPS investigator, about all the ways their love had been questioned and tested and nearly destroyed by people who couldn't understand that families came in all shapes and sizes. "We should frame this," she managed finally. Right next to Isaiah's first drawing and your father's watch and all the other things that matter. Deal, Cain agreed, pulling both of them closer. Though I think the most important things we have can't be framed. No. No. His smile was soft, private, meant only for them. The most important things are right here. The photographer captured that moment too. The three of them wrapped in each other's arms, Isaiah's tiny hands patting both parents' faces as if he were blessing their reunion, all of them laughing at something only they understood. Later, when the magazine hit stands, people would see the polished version of their story. The successful business partnership, the beautiful family, the triumph over adversity that made for good copy. They'd see the fairy tale ending, the proof that love could conquer all. But Gracia knew the truth was both simpler and more complicated than any magazine story could capture. Love hadn't conquered anything. They had. Through hard work and honest conversation and the daily choice to keep showing up for each other, even when it was difficult. Through learning that trust had to be rebuilt brick by brick, that forgiveness was a process rather than an event, and that the strongest foundations were built on truth rather than fantasy. As they walked out of the studio into the golden afternoon light, Isaiah holding both their hands and chattering happily about the big lights and pretty lady with the camera, Gracia realized this wasn't really an ending at all. It was a beginning. The start of whatever came next for the Monroe Blackwood family, who'd learned that the best love stories weren't about perfect people finding each other, but about imperfect people choosing each other, again and again, until the choice became as natural as breathing. What would you have done? She asked Cain as they waited for their car, watching Isaiah try to catch pigeons on the sidewalk. If I hadn't given you a second chance? If I'd stayed angry forever? Cain considered the question seriously, his arm tightening around her waist. I would have kept trying, he said finally. For as long as it took, in whatever way you'd let me. Because some things are worth fighting for forever. Even if forever is a very long time. Especially then. He pressed a kiss to her temple, breathing in the scent of her hair and the promise of all their tomorrows. After all, we've got a little boy to raise, a business empire to run, and about 60 years of making up for lost time. Gracia leaned into his warmth, watching their son's fearless exploration of the world around him, and smiled. I can't think of anywhere else I'd rather spend forever. And as Isaiah came running back to them, arms outstretched and face bright with joy, shouting Mama. Dada! Up! Up! Both parents reached for him at the same time, lifting him between them in a moment of perfect synchronicity that felt like coming home. The story that had started with secrets and lies and broken hearts had become something else entirely. A love story built to last, strong enough to weather any storm, and deep enough to build a legacy on. Not because it was easy, but because it was true. Not because they were perfect, but because they were perfectly matched. Not because love conquered all, but because they'd learned that the best kind of love wasn't a feeling that happened to you. It was a choice you made, again and again, until the choosing became as natural as breathing. And they chose each other. Today, tomorrow, and for all the forevers yet to come. What would you have done in their place? Tell us your favorite love story in the comments. Hit the like button if you believe in love.